Hello and welcome to my step-by-step guide on choosing a colour palette for a multicoloured knitting project. Before I start with the step-by-step information, I just want to say that this is the kind of things that I've learned over time, both by choosing colours for knitting and also by choosing colours for beading. This is mostly my opinion. I'm not a colour theory expert, so please feel free to do whatever you like with your colours, but I thought I'd put this little guide together as it was requested by a friend. So without further ado, let's go. Step 1, choose a colour that you love or really want to work with. I do not believe in knitting with a colour that you don't like. So for me, that's a lot of this. Just go for it. So choose one colour that you love. Then step 2 is get inspired by things around you, whether that's textiles, objects, nature, anything that you look at and go, that's a lovely colour combination. So first of all, nature has a lot of inspirational colour combinations. For me, I gravitate towards green and pink quite a lot, which is a very kind of flowery palette, where you've got the pink flower and the green leaves. Other things that could inspire you are fabrics. For example, my cushion here, which is from my lounge, has a number of colours that I really like the burnt orange, the turquoise, dark blue and teal. And then it also has a background neutral of beige to offset all of those lovely colours. So you could use that as inspiration. You could use fabrics, such as this very tropical one that I've got for making a bag, where you've got a number of different colours again, with a turquoise background. Or you can use traditional designs. So this is a Japanese puzzle box, and what you could do is pick out the different elements of colour in here. For example, I would pick out this one as the kind of darker, richer brown, perhaps a slightly lighter brown, maybe that one, or maybe like a beigey grey, or something like this for the lighter colour. And what you end up with is maybe some colour work that draws its inspiration from something like this. Other ways of getting inspiration are Ravelry. For example, if you're looking at a specific pattern that you want to knit, there are often a lot of people, either test knitters or other people who posted their projects on Ravelry, who have the opportunity of giving other people colour ideas. So have a little browse on Ravelry if you're knitting a project from there, and see what other people have done as well. I sometimes get some really lovely inspiration for not only yarn but also colours to use from Ravelry. And finally, I really like a website called Design Seeds for creating multicoloured palettes. This comes from when I was doing a lot of beading work. I picked up on it and I would use that as a way of choosing a 4 or 5 colour palette that is also based on a photograph or an image that they've chosen. It's a really good website to browse on, and I'll stick the link below. Step 3, consider what type of effect you want. Do you want something high contrast? So for example, in colour work, something like the sweater that I'm wearing, where you've got a very stark white on a green background. Or do you want something more muted? So do you want a slightly gradient effect, which means you want to choose colours that are closer together? As an example of this, you could do some colour work with something like this blue and this blue, and that would look really lovely, but the colour work would not stand out as much. So that's something to consider, is how much contrast you actually want in your project. Do you want it high contrast or do you want it subtle? Do you want it cool? So for example, like blue tones, or do you want it warm? For example, the orange tones. Or do you want it a bit of both? Because actually those two work quite well together. Something additional to consider is how prominent are the colours going to be and which way around you want them. I have an example of this, which is based on a swatch that I've got here. So here the main colour is this lovely raspberry pink, and then the lesser colour is the grey, because of the way that I've knit up the swatch. In contrast, the final result actually has more grey than pink, so I feel like it has a significantly different effect. Because the colour works quite fine, the pink becomes much more muted in this versus this, where the pink is the main colour. So consider which one of your two or more colours you want to be the foreground, or which one you want to be the background, and have a think about how that stands out. My yoke, for example, would look very different if I'd used the green for the colour work detail instead of the white, and the white as the background. What I tend to do as a rule is, once I've chosen my main colour that I want to use, is choose a neutral colour to go with it. Now that could be a dark neutral or a light neutral. I'll go through what I mean by some of those now. So for example, the dark neutral could be a black, which would stand out against lighter colours. So for example, orange, black and white. Or it could be a dark grey that's slightly variegated, like this one. Or a solid grey. Or I actually consider navy blue to be a neutral, because I use it a lot against other colours, just as it's not as stark as black as a solid colour. In terms of light neutrals, there's obviously white, which I've used here in this colour work yoke. Beige, light grey, it's a very popular one, kind of mottled browny grey, looks really nice as well, or something more of a purpley grey works too with certain colours. Step 4. Consider what patterns you've got on your project. So for example, if you've got something which is very cabled or very lacy, you might find that it's better to use a solid colour rather than something very variegated or speckled, because the pattern will get lost in the colour. I'll show you an example of this on the screen now, where I knit a cabled hat and out of very busy yarn, and it ended up being lost. So think about what patterns are going to be in the project. If there's something very fine in terms of colour work, or there's some sort of textured pattern, be careful about what colours you're using for that part. And finally, my biggest bit of advice is swatch. That actually gives you a really good idea of how your project is going to look at the end, how the colours are going to play together, and what the effect is that they're going to have. So, for example, for my Jupiter crop sweater, I did a little swatch like this in the round, just to see how those colours played together and to make sure that they stood out enough in the colour work. Next, I'm going to show you a few projects and colour combinations that I would use as a bit of inspiration for you. So the first one is quite a muted colour palette and has a more subtle look, so it isn't very high contrast, and that's this swatch here. So you've got a gradient effect here where you've got a kind of darker teal colour, a turquoise and a light grey. And I really like this kind of gradient effect. It creates a much more subtle colour change. So my final project ended up being the Avelana shawl by Audrey of Yarnflakes, and that's this one. So you can see it's got quite a lot of grey, but it looks really nice and subtle. The darker teal actually contrasts quite nicely with the light grey as a neutral, but it looks really lovely and smooth. As another option, I'm going to show you another shawl with quite contrasty colours. So this is my Festival of Stitches, which I showed on the podcast recently, and that's got 3 quite contrasted colours. The red contrasts a lot with the kind of white beigey colour, and then the tannery, which is the gold colour, adds a bit of a different element. So I've actually picked out that as one of the colours in the speckle of the white to use. But you can see the speckle, because it's lightly speckled, actually works really well as a neutral. And then you've got the lovely white and red as the colour work. I don't think that would have looked quite as nice if it had been the gold and red, but it would have looked quite good with gold and white. Another one which is very contrasty and quite a stark set of colours is this one. So to me, as I mentioned, I would consider dark blue as a neutral because I use it quite a lot, and the white is of course a neutral, so you almost get like a, if it was black for example, it would look black and white, but then I've got this one pop of coral that offsets really nicely against the dark blue, and gives you that really bright colour in with the more muted ones. And lastly, I'm just going to show you, this is my husband's cowl that I knit for him. This is a pattern by Max the Knitter, and I'll put the description or the actual name below. So this uses some of the colours that I've got here. So these two, and then a darker blue. So you can see it's a really nice combination with the dark blue and the Midnight Fox colour. But then I've also got the gold in there. That's picked out from the speckle of the Midnight Fox. And inside is this lovely gold colour as well. I really like the idea of picking out a colour from a speckle, just because it highlights that colour and enhances it. This one is a very variegated colour. I think this is a one of a kind from Stranded Dyeworks, Amy, and I've paired it with quite a, I suppose, a very slightly variegated grey, but not very. You can see it offsets quite nicely. The colour work section is actually very muted, so you can't see much contrast between the grey and the pink because they're actually quite close together, whereas something like, let's say, a beige would really contrast well with that pink colour. But yeah, the stripes look very good. the colour work looks very subtle. You can hardly see the grey in there. It's just an interesting play with the two different colours, and that's why I think it's worth looking at what type of pattern you're going to be doing before you make a final decision. So for example, this one, I'd recommend swatching the colour work rather than just the stripes. Then we've got something with a bit of a speckle as a contrast to the darker colour, which is here. And as you can see, I've used a kind of neutral in that it is beige, but it has bits of the blue in there. But I think don't shy away from using that in colour work, because actually it looks really lovely. You don't have to use very stark contrasts or opposite colours all the time. It's got a really nice effect if you put something with a speckle into something which is a darker version of that. Then finally something which is very high contrast. So this is one of the first shawls that I knit in a kind of burgundy, which was the colour that I picked, and then I looked for that contrast neutral, which is the beige. So very high contrast all the way across. That one is the Road to Rhinebeck shawl by Mina Philip, who's also the knitting expat. Moving on to actual yarn combinations, I'll just pick out a few to show you. So these two at the top here, which is the green and the white, I'm looking at making a colour work top from. I've got 3 skeins of the green, and then I'm using the white as the contrast, so a little bit like my colour work yoke here. The orange and the just rust colour, which is the one next to it, I'm going to be doing a stripy shawl with. So I thought these two would offset really nicely, because again I'm picking out the colour from the speckle and making that something bolder within that project. So I've got a really bold colour and then a neutral with a light speckle of that colour. Then with the turquoise here, I've got again a similar sort of combination, but much more cold as a colour combination. And then this is a very similar combo to what I've got in the cowl that I showed you earlier. So a blue, a neutral, and the gold, which offsets really nicely with the Midnight Fox colour and the blue. In terms of busier colourways, I've got something like this, which has a lot of colour in it. It's got both gold, green and blue, and a bit of yellow as well. So what sort of thing would I do with that? My main thing that I would pick is probably pair it with something neutral. So for example, a white. But otherwise, like I said, I would probably pick out maybe turquoise to go with it, or actually the lovely tannery colour there would go really nicely with that as a colour combination. So if we went for something like this, you've got your contrast with the white and then a bit of the colour picked out with the gold. This is quite a light, nice, I don't know, marshmallow pink, I would say. This is Modern Love by Strand Dyeworks. And to go with that, I would probably use something quite dark. So something like navy blue goes really well. But you could also put it with quite a light grey, like that, and it would be much more subtle. Very similar to the shawl that I showed you in the pink and grey, actually. There. I think that looks really nice. And then finally I've got this one, which is kind of a skein I fell in love with and haven't thought about what I'm going to do with yet. So there's a lot of options here because there's a lot of different colours. Again, you can see my love of that burnt orange because look at that together. That'd be lovely. But let's see what else we can come up with in terms of a combination. So something like this, which is the burnt orange, would go really nicely. But you'd probably want something more muted as well, so that might work. Kind of browny grey. Or something like a beige for a high contrast. Or even something like black for high contrast. That looks cool actually. This is, by the way, Donegal DK by Olan in the Samhain colour. I'm looking forward to using this at some point. So I think that's all the advice I have at the moment, but I'll run through my steps quickly now. I hope this has been helpful. Please like and subscribe if you can, and let me know if you have any suggestions or comments in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching. Bye!